Today, the next section of the program, I'm going to give an overview of the background report that everyone has a copy of. When I was setting out to do this report and speaking to the chair of the panel and said, you know, what is the brief for the writing up this report? What do we want to include? And the brief that she said was, we want an overview of reading. What does the research say? What are the plans that are out there? What are the budgets? We just want to know the truth related to these things. Give us the facts. Put it on the table so that there's something that we can work around, that we can talk to. And I think that was the aim of the background report. So the 8 different sections that we're going to be speaking about, which follow the different sections of the report, the aim here is both to say what are the trajectories that we're on so far. If we continue at our current business as usual, the current rate of progress, where are we likely to get to? Looking at COVID, looking at plans and other countries. How have other countries tackled this? What are the lessons that we can learn from some of these other countries? As well as looking at budgets and what are priorities in South Africa. And not just what do we say are priorities, but what are the priorities that are revealed in the budget, which is critical. To talk about the role of philanthropy, and then also to talk about trends that are coming in South Africa, and particularly one trend, which is teacher retirements, the incoming wave of teacher retirements. So the first one, which I think everyone in this room is now familiar with, is that 78% of grade 4 children in South Africa cannot read for meaning in any language. However, as you can see in the graph on the right over here, the percentage of children that can read for meaning has actually been improving over time. It was 13% in 2006, rising to 18% in 2011, up to 22% in 2016. Of course, this was before the pandemic. However, it's also important to recognize that this is not just Pearls that's showing us this information. It's also supported by other assessments. We also know that, and I'll show you those other assessments in a moment, we also know that that 22% figure, that 22% of kids can read, is actually very different depending on if you're in a wealthy school compared to if you are in a poor school. These are all of the no-fee schools in our system and the percentage of children that learn how to read compared to children in fee-charging schools, where at least 70% of children learn how to read. So clearly there's also a socioeconomic dimension in terms of who gets access to the resources, the teachers, and the home environments that do lead to children learning how to read. And that's something that we have to tackle. But some positive news is that all of the international assessments that we take part in, and a lot of the researchers that have done this work are in the room now, have shown that there have been improvements in learning outcomes for basically all children that enrolled in grade 1 from 1994 onwards. So for children that were already in the schooling system, which are these 2 black sections over here, the 2 bars over here, there was no improvement in their learning outcomes. But for children who were in about grade 1 in 1994, all of these different assessments are showing that there were improvements over time. This is not a contested finding in South Africa. There's only one exception to that, which is the latest TIMS grade 5 study, which is conducted by the HSRC. On our current trajectory, if we extend our current trajectory that we've just seen, 13% to 18%, 22%, on this status quo trajectory, we will only get to 36% of children reading for meaning by 2031, which is the year when Pearls is going to be conducted. In order to achieve a different trajectory, we obviously need to introduce many reforms, which were mentioned, some of those were mentioned by the chair. But if you continue on this trajectory, as the chair mentioned, this will take 80 years. It'll be the year 2098 when all children in South Africa learn to read for meaning on our current trajectory of improvement. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves today is, what are the types of reforms that would need to be introduced to take us from this trajectory onto a different trajectory? And we don't yet know what the answers to those questions are. At least we're not seeing the answers to those questions in the system at the moment. But if we were even more ambitious in saying we want to get onto this top system to make sure that by 2030 all children learn to read for meaning, the question then we have to ask ourselves is, what needs to change? What do we need to do differently if we want to get onto that green trajectory as opposed to remaining on that bottom trajectory that will take us 80 years before children learn how to read, which is our business as usual. It's what we are currently doing. That will take us to 36% of kids reading for meaning by 2031. It would require a system overhaul to get onto that system. I don't think that it's an understatement to say that we would need to overhaul the entire system. One of the things, and this is new information that was done by researchers in the Department of Basic Education, as well as some of the universities that looked at learning losses using the early grade reading study schools in the Northwest. And what they did was they went back to the same schools that were assessed in 2018 and went back to those exact same schools in 2021. And what they found was that the grade 4 students from 2021 knew less than the grade 3 students of 2018. In other words, the learning losses as a result of school closures and rotational timetables have been more than 1 year. It's about 1.3 years. If you think of our rate of progress, that's the equivalent of wiping out 6.5 years of progress, the 1.3 years of learning loss, because there were improvements in the system before the pandemic. In terms of the Department of Basic Education's catch-up plan, I did a review when I looked at all of the presentations to Parliament reported by the PMG group to see what were those plans. The summary of this is from the August 2021 Parliamentary Portfolio Committee. The committee heard that COVID-19 pandemic has adversely affected the basic education sector through the temporary school closures to reduce the spread of the virus. Various remote learning interventions had been implemented to mitigate the impact of learning, and DBE, in collaboration with NECT, provincial education departments, and partners, has implemented remote learning programs which include remote lessons via broadcasting, TV and radio, and online platforms, as well as virtual classrooms. Benefits of the program are an interactive online education platform for educators and learners, leading to effective and efficient teaching and learning. It is accessible to teachers and learners anywhere and anytime using different web-enabled devices. It equips learners with 21st century skills for the workplace and supports the emergence of a new type of school. This is disingenuous, and it's not an accurate representation of the support that's available to schools on the ground. Only 17 schools were equipped with virtual classroom solution, if you look at the PowerPoint. The Warza Matrix YouTube channel had less than 7,000 subscribers and less than 60,000 views, despite there being 700,000 matrics. As well as the TV program that was made available is one television program for 12.5 million children. In other words, less than 30 minutes of programming per day. There's also no evidence that access to zero-rated websites without feedback and support leads to learning. It's important to note that in the general household survey, only 9% of South African households with children have an internet connection. Given all of this, I don't think it's an overstatement to say at the moment there is no structured, systematic, and funded plan to catch up those COVID learning losses that we've seen. In terms of what does it look like, even outside of COVID, to have the trajectory, to get onto a steeper trajectory, how might that happen? If we review international evidence, is it even possible to drastically improve learning outcomes? There's new research that's documented in the report coming out of Brazil, Mexico, and Kenya. This is just an example of one state, the state of Ceará in Brazil, showing you that within 12 years, the state, as well as the main city in that state, managed to drastically improve literacy outcomes, such that in 2000, when this was originally conceptualized, more than 2/3 of children could not read a single word. This radically changed as they moved from 2005 to 2017, with 84% of students achieving adequate literacy scores by the end of grade 3. So clearly, although it is not the norm that we see drastic improvements in reading outcomes, it has been done in certain states and certain countries in the past. The second one here is to look what are the essential ingredients from international research, reviewing these different countries. This is part of the Learning at Scale study. These are programs that have been rigorously independently evaluated and shown to lead to improvements in reading outcomes. The programs are in India, Tanzania, Ghana, Kenya, Pakistan, Senegal, and Nigeria. And I think it's very useful for us as a collective of people, and many of these conclusions, we will look at them and say, this agrees with our local research. We find very similar conclusions in our local work. What are the essential classroom ingredients and teacher practices that lead to gains in learning outcomes in reading? The first one is that teachers showed the relationship between sounds and letters through a phonics-based instruction in all of the programs. There was a systematic and explicit direct instruction, and instructional time was made available for reading, and the largest amount of instructional time was dedicated to reading specifically. Students consistently used improved reading materials, and they were engaged through a variety of instructional materials and active student engagement. You summarize this as improving learning at scale requires better teaching than is typically the case. The second element that they reviewed was to ask what are the methods of training and support that were used across all of these different programs. The first one was that training focused on the use of modeling and practice of the new instructional practices that we wanted teachers to perform. Secondly, and this is critical given the South African emphasis on the train-the-trainer model, initial training was typically face-to-face. Coaches were provided to each of these different interventions and provided structure in how they supported teachers. Teacher guides simplified the instructional progress, and books were provided on a 1-to-1 ratio. It wasn't everyone sharing a kind of communal resource. Teacher support was collaborative, it increased teacher confidence, and it also helped teachers solve problems in their classrooms. In order to improve teachers' pedagogical methods, teachers need support. And then lastly, what are the system supports? The first one was that these programs all established very clear priorities. A small number of clearly defined, time-bound priorities. Programs were aligned with existing government plans. And I know that for some of the initial existing programs, and one of the background notes here was written by Mary Metcalf as the PILO intervention, which does exactly this to try and say, what is the existing programs of government and how might we align this within that program? Communicating program expectations down through the system, government monitoring, and capacity building efforts. Now, I think what's important for us to look at in South Africa is not just what is happening internationally, but also what is happening locally. The summary of that international example, they found programs that link participation to career incentives, they have specific subject focus areas, incorporate lesson enactment, and include initial face-to-face training were the ones that were successful. Most at-scale teacher professional development programs differ sharply from those programs that showed this is how you teach effectively. So at the moment, I think in South Africa, we don't have any rigorous evidence that shows that the train-the-trainer model leads to learning outcomes improvements. The frequency of subject advisor visits is simply too low, and this is not to say anything about the content knowledge of subject advisors. So what this graph is showing you is basically the frequency of subject advisor visits in South Africa per province according to grade 3 teachers. This is the School Monitoring Survey of 2017. So the blue here is none. So in Limpopo, more than 2/3 of teachers reported that they were never visited by a subject advisor in the last year. This was once, this is twice, that's 3 times, and the green here is at least 4 times. So at least once per term, which is the bare minimum of what is required for instructional support. And those are the green bars here. And again, this is not to say what was happening during the visits. In terms of local programs in South Africa, the 4 programs that we have evidence for, and again here the importance is, do we have causal evidence that this led to an improvement in reading outcomes or not? There are many interventions in South Africa that have been done, and there are many lessons that we can learn from those interventions. But if we are asking which intervention should be scaled up, which of these many hundreds of interventions, how do we adjudicate between them, we have to ask which has strong causal evidence that led to an improvement in reading outcomes. The first one is GPLMS. It was done in 915 schools in Gauteng, led under the MEC Creasy, and I'll come back to this in terms of the costing. What did that actually cost to do that at a province level? The second one is the early grade reading study, and for both of these, many of the researchers that led this are in the audience. The early grade reading study, which was done in 180 no-fee schools in the Northwest, as part of a randomized control trial and showed that the gains were about 60% of a year of learning for on-site coaching. This is using one particular definition of a year of learning. In terms of the Funda Wande intervention in the Eastern Cape and the Funda Wande intervention in Limpopo, which used teaching assistants and coaching, 3 of these 4 interventions used an instructional coach that visited teachers in the classroom and helped them and offered support in terms of how they might change their teaching practice. Coaches are often thought of as being a very expensive intervention and therefore not scalable. But unfortunately, these are the only interventions we have evidence for that lead to improvements in reading outcomes. The question needs to be, how can we find the resources to pay for these interventions that seem to have evidence of learning at scale, rather than how can we adapt the budgets that we have to work. I think it's also important to note that every single one of those 4 programs offered a minimum set of resources to every single school that they worked with. So the chair mentioned earlier that the only universal resource that we have in all primary schools is the DBE workbook. What these programs all did was to provide this minimum core set of foundation phase materials like storybooks, graded readers, big books, etc. Moving on to the budget, I think it's a very useful exercise to not just say, is reading a priority in South Africa? What do we mean when we say reading is a priority in South Africa? Does it mean that we say it's in a document that says it's a priority? In other words, it's a stated priority. Or do we say that it is a revealed priority? In other words, we can see in the budget, for example, that this is reflected. I distinguish here between 3 different kinds of policies. You get policies that are announced, funded, and planned. The ideal is that it's all 3. You want a plan that gets implemented to have both planning, it gets announced, and it's funded. That's the ideal. Something like the school nutrition program or the DBE workbooks. Both of those are good examples of that. Sometimes you get policy by speech. This is when something is announced, there was no plan, and then it does have funding. Unfortunately, in the reading sector, we are in this point over here of policies that are symbolic. In other words, they are announced, but there's no plan and there's no funding that's attached to it. I'll give you an example of symbolic policies. Read to lead. Drop all and read. The 1,000 School Libraries campaign. The Book Flood campaign. Reading clubs, spelling bees, EGRA training, the President's Virtual Reading Circle. All of these are examples where there isn't actually a budget that's attached to it. It's an intention, it's an aspiration, but even something like the 1,000 School Libraries campaign, there wasn't a budget provided to deliver those 1,000 libraries in the schools. It was actually a request to the private sector to donate books to create 1,000 libraries. And I think here the point that I wanted to make on this is that there needs to be a distinction between projects that are funded versus projects that are announced. And at the moment, we have many projects that are announced, but they lack funding. And I want to go through this to show you exactly how much money has been allocated in the budgets for reading. So in the medium-term strategic framework, what you can see, I'll get to this graph in a moment, 14 million rand, 1-4, was allocated for rolling out best practices such as lesson plans, graded reading books, individualized coaching of teachers, and EGRS teaching, reading, and other innovations. 54 million rand was allocated from the ETDP CETA for professional teacher development, and the scale-up of the EGRS that's currently in the Northwest through the early grade reading program has 17 million rand per year for 140 schools. Although the MTSF lists reading 24 times, it's listed as the apex priority for foundation phase in the medium-term strategic framework, the word reading doesn't appear in the budget in 2021. So to give you an example of budget, the GPLMS annual budget in 2022 rands 298 million rand for one province for 1 year. They hired 540 coaches just for Gauteng for 1,000 schools. So if you think of what that might look like, if you rolled that out to all schools in South Africa, it would cost approximately 3.4 billion rand per year. And if you just rolled it out to foundation phase, it would cost approximately 1.7 billion rand per year. This is just to try and give an estimate of, this is what GPLMS did in Gauteng. What would that cost if we did a similar sized and scaled intervention in foundation phase across the country or in primary schools across the country? And these are annual budgets. The current program in the largest program that we have in the country, the Primary School Reading Improvement Program, the PSRIP, is actually primarily at the moment on English First Additional Language. It's an EFL program, and the Home Language program is only in 102 schools. It was a pilot in 2021, and both of these are being implemented by the NECT. But depending on what this is, and I think we can clarify this in the questions, you see the budget for this as being less than 50 million rand. So this is a national program, and I think it is inevitable that you end up with light touch programs. Train the trainer, and often it's train the trainer's trainer's trainer. So if we move beyond budget, because it's not only about budget and saying that we need funded programs, one example of this, and this is actually not, this is a provincial program, the ECDOE Reading Plan. This is an example that didn't take on coaching, but costed, it hasn't been implemented, costed what would it look like to provide materials to all foundation phase classes as well as centralized training. And the estimate at the time, this was in 2019, was about 111 million rand. This again is for one province and just for the foundation phase that it's focusing. Another point that we discussed with the panel, and I think that's a really important point, and everyone can see these, the graded readers that are on the desk in front of you. This is an example of something that was actually rolled out at provincial scale. In the Eastern Cape in 2019 and 2020, every single child received an anthology of graded readers. These books cost 11 rand each because they're open access. And they were developed by Multino, paid for by Xenex to develop the Vulabula series. An evaluation that's coming out later this year is basically showing that for the cohorts that received those books in Eastern Cape, they read 3 additional words correctly per minute, isiXhosa, compared to the cohorts in the same schools the year before that did not receive the anthologies. If we rolled out this program to the entire country, it would cost 32 million rand per year for every single foundation phase child in the country to receive the book in their home language. And this is one book that they would receive and take home. So it would be an annual expense. But this is just to show that it's not only saying you can't do anything unless you're spending billions. In terms of philanthropic involvement, I see many of the people here are from a philanthropic background, CEOs of organizations and philanthropies. It's important to recognize that philanthropies collectively spend about 5.5 billion rand on education every year. All philanthropic spending is about 5.4 billion rand per year. This is in contrast if we think of what the government spends just on basic education. In the same year, it was 249 billion rand. We're not going to get to all children reading for meaning by effectively spending that dot. We cannot say that the 100 schools where we work, the 50 schools where we work, the 120 schools over there that we are spending this money on is actually what's going to get us to the 2030 goal. It won't. The only way we're going to get to the 2030 goal is if we recognize that the best use of private money is influencing how this public money gets spent. What is this big circle being spent on? We know 80% of that is on teacher salaries. But beyond that, and that's normal, this is not that atypical compared to most countries, that the vast majority of the education budget gets spent on teacher salaries. But this is what needs to be spent more effectively and leveraged if we are to reach the 2030 goal. And I think unless we see this as a lever to kind of unlock the spending there, we will not reach that 2030 goal. Now, just as the last 2 points before wrapping up and having question and answers, so please do jot down if you have questions or comments related to this. This is something that was revealed. It's something that's been known in technical policymaking circles for a while, and there's actually a large research project that's underway within RECEP that's looking at this. But this graph is from the 2021 medium-term budget policy statement. So in November last year, it's in an appendix, it's page 83. And what you can see is the pink graph here is the age distribution of teachers in 2006. And the blue graph is the age distribution of teachers in 2020. And what you can see is that retirement age, which is 60, there's a huge bulge of teachers that are about to retire. 45% of teachers will retire in the next 10 years. This is unprecedented. We have never seen something like that happen before. and we're struggling to find other countries that have had such a large demographic change. It means that this is the level of actual retirements that we've seen in South Africa, and these are the projected retirements. So it also means that we need to increase teacher production by 50% within the next 5 years and double teacher production by 2030. So we currently produce about 26,000 teachers. This will need to increase to 44,000 by 2025 and 50,000 per year by 2030. This is not this fact, this information, and there's one thing that's very persistent, is everyone ages by 1 year every year. So we know that this is going to happen. This is not a plausible, we think this is going to happen. These people will age by 1 year, and this is the teacher salary database per cell. So if that's the case, we currently have no systematic plan to deal with this. And this is not just the problem for early grade reading and reaching the 2030 goal. This is the problem for the entire education system. But it also is a potential opportunity that if you've got half of teachers that are going to be leaving the system, and there's a lot of question marks about the quality of the teachers that are currently in the system, it's possible that the new cohort of teachers that are coming in might be able to raise the quality of teaching that happens. So in the report, I summarized, this is actually from a paper by Lynn Bowie that looked at the mathematics scores of first-year B.Eds, Bachelor of Education students across 3 institutions, and final year B.Eds. These are primary school teachers. The test was a primary school maths test. Okay, it's only primary school maths content. And what it showed was that first-year B.Eds, despite having passed university matric with a bachelor's pass, scored 52% correct on average across the 3 institutions on a primary school maths test. But even more worrying is that the final year B.Eds only scored 54%. So after 4 years of full-time study, there's basically no change in the content knowledge of these maths teachers. And primary school teachers are teaching reading and maths. So at the moment, we don't have the same data for a reading assessment, but I think what it's pointing to is the severe inadequacies of initial teacher education at the moment. It's not an understatement to say that there is a crisis in initial teacher education. So this is from a paper by Nick Taylor where he says tests based on the school curriculum reveal very significant shortcomings in initial teacher education. Currently, teachers require the lowest number of matric points to enter university and are arguably the weakest matriculants at university. With that situation, even with this 50% of teachers that are leaving the system, with a new 50% that are going to replace it, we don't yet know how universities might expand enrollment and expand teacher production. But even if they could, the quality of that teacher production is currently being called into question. And I think this is now, this is not a secret what we're speaking about here. This is quite well known in the sector. So in terms of recommendations, and these are actually draft recommendations, the panel, I think, we only met yesterday. This is the recommendations that emerged out of the background report, but ones that ended up kind of being central focus points of the panel and relatively undisputed. Everyone kind of agreed with the form of it, if not the exact. The first one is to say that we currently don't have a way of measuring whether children can read or not in primary schools. There isn't a standardized assessment at the primary school level in the same way there is at the high school level. High school, we have the matric exam. At the primary school level, since 2014, when the ANAs were discontinued, we no longer have a primary school assessment. The second one is moving from slogans to budgets, or another framing of this is moving from slogans to funded programs. Because obviously just having a budget doesn't necessarily mean that it will be spent on implementation and spent effectively. Whether this is for the entire primary school or if it's only for the foundation phase, it would have budget implications. The third one, and I think this one has universal agreement, I have never found someone that disagrees with this particular recommendation. We have to provide a universal minimum set of resources in the home language to every single foundation phase class. In 2008, Minister Naledi Pandor, as part of the Foundations for Learning, listed, and it's government gazetted, 10 resources that are needed for teaching reading. Only one of those is a workbook at the learner level, basically the DBE workbooks. That is the only resource of those that is universally available in every single foundation phase classroom. So the first one would be, how do we make sure that those 10 resources are actually available in every foundation phase classroom? And the last recommendation is this university audit of pre-service teacher education programs. This is both an implication for the Department of Higher Education and Training as well as the Center for Higher Education, the CHE, around certification and the ongoing certification of these primary school programs despite what are clear inadequacies. One of the programs, that's a primary school B.Ed, had 6% of its credits allocated to literacy across a 4-year period. And this is for a primary school teacher. The last one, and I want to emphasize this is on page 20, from page 24 in the report onwards, from page 26 in the report onwards, is there are also a variety of different background notes. Many of the people that authored these notes are in the room, and I think what these do is touch on different elements and programs of what people are working on, what are the lessons that they've learned from those programs, and how might we go forward in their recommendation. What are we doing wrong? What are we doing right? What needs to change if we are to reach the 2030 goal? Because I think at the moment where there is universal consensus amongst the panel is, if we had to ask, are we currently on track to reaching the 2030 goal? The answer is no. We are not currently on track to reach that goal. We are severely off track. And there are things that we know what need to be done that we're not currently doing in order to get there.